The sun was just beginning to set over the massive estate of Harrison Wells, casting long golden shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and the freshly cut grass. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was buzzing with a mix of excitement and tension. This was the night of the year, the party that everyone who was anyone in the city desperately wanted an invitation to. Harrison Wells was not just rich. He was the kind of wealthy that made people nervous. He was a tech genius, a man who had started with nothing and built an empire that seemed to touch every part of modern life. He was also known for being unpredictable. Guests arrived in long limousines and expensive sports cars, stepping out onto the red carpet with the confidence that comes from having a lot of money and high status. The women wore sparkling gowns that probably cost more than an average car. The men were in tuxedos that were tailored to perfection. As they entered the house, they were handed glasses of champagne by servers moving silently through the crowd like ghosts. The room was decorated with huge floral arrangements and soft, golden lights that made everything look glamorous. The main topic of conversation, besides the stock market and recent vacations, was the mystery of the evening's entertainment. Harrison always kept it a secret until the last minute. Some people whispered that he had flown in a famous singer from Europe. Others were convinced he had hired a full symphony orchestra. The rumors were flying fast. A man in a gray suit stood near the towering fireplace, telling a small group of listeners that he had heard it was going to be a legendary jazz band that had retired years ago. Everyone nodded, looking impressed. They expected something flashy, something expensive, and something that would prove just how powerful Harrison was. Among the staff moving through the crowd was a young woman named Jenny. She was not a guest. She was a waitress, hired to help serve drinks and food for the evening. She wore a simple black uniform with a white apron that tied around her waist. Her hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and on her feet were comfortable black shoes, chosen for standing up for hours rather than for style. She moved through the room with a silver tray balanced perfectly on one hand, offering drinks to the guests with a polite "excuse me" or a soft champagne. Jenny was used to being invisible. At these kinds of events, the staff might as well be furniture. The guests rarely looked her in the eye. They would take a glass without even glancing at her, sometimes spilling a drop on the floor without apologizing, assuming someone else would clean it up. Jenny didn't mind. She needed this job. She was a university student studying music, trying to pay for her tuition and rent, and the tips from a night like this could cover her groceries for 2 weeks. She walked carefully, navigating around the expensive gowns and loud laughter. Keeping her head down and doing her job, the room was filled with the sound of clinking glasses and loud voices. People were bragging about their latest business deals or showing off their new watches. It was a world completely different from the one Jenny lived in. She watched them, fascinated by how different their lives were. They worried about which yacht to buy, while she worried about passing her midterms and paying the electric bill. Suddenly, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. The buzzing conversation quieted down as a spotlight hit the center of the room, right where a beautiful, shiny black grand piano sat. It looked like a piece of art, gleaming under the lights. A hush fell over the crowd as Harrison Wells himself walked onto a small stage near the piano. He was an older man with gray hair and a smile that made you think he knew a secret you didn't. He tapped the microphone, and the feedback squeal made everyone wince for a second before he started speaking. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Harrison said, his voice echoing through the room. "We have good food, we have good drinks, and we have the best company in the city. But tonight, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to share something that I found recently. Something rare." The guests leaned in, curious. They were expecting him to introduce a celebrity. A woman in the front row fixed her diamond necklace, ready to be impressed. "I believe that true talent isn't always found on a stage or on TV," Harrison continued, looking around the room. "Sometimes it is found in the most unexpected places. Tonight I have asked a young woman who has been working tirelessly all evening to serve you to come up and play for us." Confused silence swept through the room. People looked at each other, raising their eyebrows. Who was he talking about? Harrison gestured toward the back of the room, right to where Jenny was standing with her tray of empty glasses. "Please, put down the tray and come up here, Jenny," Harrison said kindly. Jenny froze. Her heart seemed to stop beating for a second. She looked around, thinking there must be another Jenny working the party. But everyone was looking at her. The guests parted like the sea, creating a path from her spot to the piano. Her face turned bright red. She felt hundreds of eyes locking onto her. This had to be a mistake. She wasn't a performer. She was just a student trying to get by. The idea of playing for these people, for real critics and wealthy millionaires, made her stomach turn over. But Harrison was still waiting, and he was the boss. She couldn't say no. Slowly, clumsily, she set her silver tray down on a side table. She smoothed down her apron, feeling incredibly underdressed in her simple uniform amongst the tuxedos and gowns. As she began to walk toward the piano, the whispers started. A man in a loud voice whispered to his friend, not bothering to keep it down. "The waitress? Is this a joke?" "Maybe it's a comedy act," another woman giggled behind her hand. "Oh dear, this is going to be painful." The mood in the room shifted instantly. The anticipation of seeing a famous star was replaced by a cruel curiosity. The guests felt uncomfortable. They felt awkward. Most of them were convinced they were about to witness a disaster. A waitress playing a concert grand piano? It seemed absurd. They expected her to be terrible. They prepared polite, pitying smiles to put on their faces when she finished, planning to clap just to be nice to their host, Harrison. They looked at her with pity and judgment, seeing only the uniform and the tray, not the person. Jenny walked up the 3 small steps to the stage. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. She could feel the sweat forming on her back. She sat down on the bench in front of the massive instrument. The piano felt huge and imposing in front of her. The silence was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a waiting silence, like the calm before a storm. She could hear people shifting in their seats, the rustle of silk dresses, and the quiet coughs of impatient men. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She looked out at the sea of faces. They were just a blur of expensive colors and judging eyes. She placed her shaking hands on the cold keys. For a moment, she thought about standing up and running out. She thought about quitting her job and never coming back. But then she looked at Harrison. He was standing to the side, watching her. He didn't look like he was making a joke. He looked serious. He nodded at her, a small, encouraging movement. He believed she could do it. Jenny closed her eyes for a second. She blocked out the guests. She forgot about the fancy clothes and the whispers. She thought about the music. She thought about the long hours of practice in her small, cramped apartment when she couldn't sleep. She let her hands hover over the keys, finding the starting position by instinct. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the first wrong note, waiting for the embarrassment to begin. But Jenny wasn't thinking about them anymore. She was about to show them that you can't judge a book by its cover, or a musician by her uniform. Jenny sat on the bench, the polished wood feeling cool and hard against her back. The silence in the room was heavy, pressing down on her ears like a physical weight. It wasn't the quiet of a library or a church. It was the tense, waiting silence of a crowd that expects a car crash. She could feel hundreds of eyes burning into her skin. From the corner of her eye, she saw a man near the front row check his watch, his face already twisted in a look of bored resignation. A woman in a sparkling blue dress was whispering behind her fan to the person next to her, barely suppressing a giggle. They had already made up their minds. To them, she was just the help. Someone who cleared empty glasses and carried trays of cheese. The idea that she possessed any real talent was laughable to them. Her heart was hammering so hard against her ribs that she thought it might be audible to the people sitting in the front row. Her palms felt sweaty, and she was terrified that her fingers might slip on the keys. She took a long, shaky breath and tried to focus. She remembered the late nights in her small apartment, playing on an old secondhand keyboard that had sticky keys because she couldn't afford a real piano. She remembered the hours of practice while her roommates were asleep, using headphones so she wouldn't wake them. This moment was why she had done all of that. This was her chance, even if it felt like a punishment right now. She looked down at the black and white keys. They looked back at her, silent and waiting. She didn't want to play. She wanted to run back to the kitchen, put on her apron, and hide. But Harrison was still standing there, his arms crossed, looking at her with a calmness that helped steady her nerves. He wasn't laughing. He was waiting for the music. So, Jenny closed her eyes for a split second, blocking out the chandeliers and the judgmental faces. She let her hands hover over the keys, finding the familiar positions that had been drilled into her muscle memory over years of practice. Then, she started. She didn't start with a simple, gentle melody to ease them in. She didn't play Happy Birthday or a basic pop song. Instead, she launched straight into a complex, thundering classical piece. Her right hand struck the high notes with a sharpness that cut through the air like a knife, while her left hand immediately set a deep, driving rhythm on the lower keys. For the first 3 seconds, the room was dead silent. Then the sound exploded from the piano. It wasn't just noise. It was music filled with power and intensity. The sound filled every corner of the massive ballroom. The man who had been checking his watch froze, his hand hovering in midair. The woman with the fan lowered it slowly, her mouth falling open slightly. The look of bored expectancy vanished from their faces instantly, replaced by a look of pure shock. Jenny's transformation was physical and immediate. The second her fingers touched the keys, the shy, scared waitress disappeared. Her back straightened. Her shoulders, which had been hunched forward in insecurity, pulled back. Her face, which had been pale and nervous, suddenly looked fierce and concentrated. She wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. She was looking through them. Her eyes lost their fear and took on a distant, focused gaze, as if she were seeing things in the room that no one else could see. Her fingers began to fly across the keyboard. To the guests watching, it looked impossible. Her hands moved with a speed and precision that seemed almost inhuman. They were a blur of motion, dancing from one end of the piano to the other. She wasn't just pressing buttons. She was attacking the keys, pulling emotion out of the instrument. The music swelled and grew louder, then dropped to a whisper, and roared back again like a storm. The reaction rippled through the room like a wave. Near the back, a group of younger guests stopped talking and turned to stare. Their drinks were forgotten in their hands. The skepticism that had filled the room just moments ago evaporated. It was replaced by a growing sense of awe. People who had been ready to whisper insults to their neighbors were now straining their necks to get a better look at the stage. They were trying to reconcile the image of the girl in the simple black uniform with the incredible sound washing over them. It didn't make sense to them. Waitresses didn't play like this. Juilliard's professors played like this. Concert masters played like this. As the piece continued, Jenny lost track of where she was. The grand ballroom, the expensive dresses, the wealthy millionaires it all faded into the background. The only thing that existed in her world was the music. She felt the vibrations of the piano traveling up through the bench and into her body. She felt the power of every chord she struck. It was a feeling of total freedom. In her normal life, she was quiet, subservient, and invisible. But here, at this piano, she was in control. She was the one telling the story. The music was angry and sad and beautiful all at the same time. She poured every bit of her stress, her hard work, and her hidden dreams into the sound. The guests were completely captivated. The atmosphere in the room had changed from awkwardness to pure magic. The clinking of glasses had stopped completely. No one was checking their phones. No one was bored. A tall man in a gray suit who had been smirking when Jenny walked up now stood with his mouth slightly open. He looked at his wife, his eyes wide, and shook his head in disbelief. He had been expecting a disaster, a funny story to tell at the office on Monday. Instead, he was witnessing something extraordinary. Even the people who didn't know much about classical music could tell that this was difficult. They could see the speed of her hands. They could hear the complexity of the notes. It wasn't a simple tune. It was a labyrinth of sound that she was navigating without a single mistake. The fear of failure that had paralyzed Jenny in the first few minutes was gone, replaced by a raw, undeniable confidence. She was in her element, and she was stunning. The music began to slow down. The frantic, racing tempo shifted into a softer, more melodic passage. Jenny's touch on the keys became gentle. She caressed the notes, pulling a sweet, haunting sound from the instrument. The lights overhead reflected off the shiny black surface of the piano as her hands moved gracefully. The contrast was striking. The girl in the modest uniform, sitting in the center of this palace of luxury, creating something that money couldn't buy. The room was so quiet now that you could hear soft squeak of the bench as Jenny leaned into the music. The air seemed to vibrate with the last lingering notes she played. She wasn't just performing. She was baring her soul to a room full of strangers who had judged her without saying a word. And as she played the final, intricate runs of the section, leaning her head back slightly, lost in the melody, the audience realized with a jolt that the disaster they had predicted was actually the highlight of their year. They weren't bored anymore. They were spellbound. The first few seconds of Jenny's performance had shattered the silence like a glass vase hitting a marble floor. The loud, aggressive chords of Rachmaninoff filled the massive ballroom, echoing off the high ceilings and bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. The sound was so full and rich that it seemed to vibrate right through the velvet chairs and into the chests of the people sitting in them. It wasn't just music. It was a physical force. For the first minute, the room was in a state of suspended animation. The people who had been ready to laugh, ready to sneer, or ready to pity the poor waitress were now struck absolutely dumb. A man near the front row, who had been smirking and preparing to make a sarcastic comment to his date, slowly closed his mouth. His drink remained halfway to his lips, forgotten. The look on his face was one of complete confusion. His brain was trying to process what his ears were hearing, because it didn't match what his eyes were seeing. He saw a girl in a cheap black uniform, but he heard a master pianist. As the music continued, the skepticism in the room began to melt away, replaced by a growing sense of awe. The piece Jenny was playing was incredibly difficult. It required hands that could move independently of each other, flying up and down the keyboard with impossible speed. Her left hand was playing a deep, rolling rhythm while her right hand was plucking out intricate, weaving melodies that floated high above the noise. To anyone who knew anything about music, it was clear that this wasn't a beginner stumbling through a song. This was a virtuoso displaying complete control. The transformation in Jenny was undeniable. The shy, hunched girl who had walked up to the stage with trembling hands was gone. In her place was a woman of power and intensity. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. She sat tall on the bench, her back straight, her shoulders strong. Her face was no longer red with embarrassment. It was pale with concentration. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly back as if she were listening to a voice that only she could hear. She wasn't thinking about the tips she needed or the rent she had to pay. She was in a different world. A world where the only thing that mattered was the music pouring out of her. The guests began to lean forward in their seats. The atmosphere in the room shifted from awkward anticipation to captivated silence. You could hear a pin drop, which was something that rarely happened in a room full of wealthy, important people who were used to being the center of attention. But tonight, they weren't the stars. They were the audience. A woman in a sequined dress near the back stood up, unable to see from her seat. She craned her neck to get a better look at the stage, a look of pure amazement on her face. She whispered to the person next to her that she had attended concerts in famous halls in Vienna and New York, and she had never felt anything like this. The emotion in the playing was raw. It wasn't polished and perfect like a recording you buy in a store. It was alive. It was dangerous. It felt like Jenny was pouring her life story into the keys, every struggle and every hidden hope translated into sound. As the song moved into a faster, more frantic section, Jenny's fingers became a blur. They moved so fast that it looked almost like a magic trick. People watching held their breath without realizing it. They were waiting for her to make a mistake. They were waiting for the disaster they had predicted, thinking that surely she would slip up, that she would hit a wrong note or lose her place. But the mistake never came. She attacked the piano with a ferocity that was startling. She wasn't being gentle with the instrument. She was demanding everything it had, and the piano was responding with a roar. The contrast was overwhelming. Here was this grand setting, full of people who had spent thousands of dollars on their outfits, watching a girl who probably made minimum wage, but for these few minutes the balance of power had flipped completely. Jenny wasn't serving them anymore. She was dominating them. She was commanding the room with a talent that money couldn't buy. Harrison Wells, the billionaire host, stood in the shadows of the stage, with a small, satisfied smile on his face. He watched the guests, enjoying their reactions more than the music itself. He saw the realization dawning on their faces that they had been wrong. Their judgment, their arrogance, and their quickness to look down on someone else had been proven. Wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The music began to soften again. The crashing waves of sound turned into gentle ripples. Jenny's touch became feather-light. She played a quiet, haunting melody that seemed to float in the air above the room. It was so beautiful that it brought tears to the eyes of some of the guests. These were people who were used to getting everything they wanted, who were rarely moved by anything anymore. Yet here they were, on the verge of tears because of a girl they had ignored all night. The young man who had been checking his watch, Leo was now leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. He wasn't bored anymore. He was completely entranced. He looked at the tray Jenny had left in the corner of the room, then back at the girl pouring her soul into the instrument. He felt a strange pang of guilt in his chest. He realized that he had seen her earlier handing him a drink, and he hadn't even looked at her face. He had just seen a uniform. Now he realized there was a whole universe of talent and depth inside that uniform that he had been too blind to see as the piece neared its climax. Jenny's playing became intense again, building up the tension higher and higher. The guests were on the edge of their seats. It felt like a storm was brewing inside the ballroom. She was playing with a passion that was almost scary. It was the kind of passion that comes from having something to prove. She wasn't just playing notes. She was fighting. She was fighting against the idea that she wasn't good enough. She was fighting against the hard life she had led. And in that moment, she was winning. The final notes of the first movement were approaching. The crowd could feel it coming. Jenny's hands flew across the keys, hitting the final chords with a force that rang out like a bell. Then, as the last note echoed through the hall and began to fade into silence, she didn't stop. She flowed immediately into the next part, keeping the audience trapped in her web. There was no break for them to clap. There was no break for them to recover. She wasn't playing a concert where she stopped for applause between songs. She was telling a story, and she wasn't done talking yet. The guests let out a collective breath they didn't know they were holding and sank back into their chairs, surrendering to the music completely under the spell of the waitress who had surprised them all. The music flowing from the piano had shifted, moving away from the loud, fast thunder that had grabbed everyone's attention. Now, the notes were slower, deeper, and filled with a heavy sadness that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The guests in the ballroom were no longer shifting in their seats or checking their phones. They were statues, frozen in a moment of time that none of them had expected when they arrived that evening. The initial shock of the girl's talent was beginning to settle into a deeper curiosity about who she really was and why she was serving them drinks instead of playing on a stage. In the middle of the room, a man in a very expensive tuxedo leaned over to his wife. But for once, he wasn't going to whisper a snide comment. He looked genuinely bewildered. He whispered softly that there was no way a server at a catering hall could play like that without years of expensive training. He pointed out that her technique was flawless, her posture perfect. It's the kind of thing that takes a lifetime of discipline to master. He wondered aloud, just to the people standing near him, if this was all some sort of elaborate prank. Perhaps an actress pretending to be a waitress. But the raw emotion in the music felt too real to be an act. It felt like it was coming from a place of pain and experience, something you can't learn in an acting class. While the crowd speculated, the real story of Jenny's life was unfolding in the quiet corners of their minds, though they didn't know it yet. Jenny hadn't always been a waitress. She had grown up in a house where music was the only escape. Her parents had worked 2 jobs each just to keep the lights on. They had loved her, but they had no money for fancy music schools or private tutors. Jenny had learned on an old, beat-up upright piano that a neighbor had thrown away. She had taught herself to read music from library books because she couldn't afford the lessons. By the time she was 15, it was clear to everyone who heard her that she was a prodigy. She had the kind of natural talent that most professional musicians spend their whole lives trying to find. She had managed to get a scholarship to a prestigious conservatory in the city, a place that was usually reserved for the wealthy and the elite. For 2 years, she had walked the marble halls of that school, carrying her beat-up books, while students around her drove cars that cost more than her parents' house. She had practiced in the practice rooms until her fingers bled, trying to prove she belonged there. She was brilliant, and her professors had told her she was destined for a career on the world stage. They said she could play in any orchestra she wanted, but life has a way of interfering with dreams, especially for those without a safety net. In her 3rd year, tragedy struck. Her father became very ill, and the medical bills piled up. Her mother, exhausted from working double shifts, could no longer keep up with the rent. The scholarship that paid for her tuition didn't pay for her living expenses or her family's mounting debts. Jenny had faced an impossible choice. She could stay in school, follow her dream, and watch her family lose everything. Or she could drop out, get a job, and save them. She had chosen her family. It hadn't been a hard choice to make, but it had been a heartbreaking one. She had walked away from the conservatory, leaving her dreams on the practice room floor. She took the first job she could find, which was serving at high-end events like this one. It was a cruel irony. She was surrounded by the very world she had been training to join. But instead of being on stage, she was cleaning up empty glasses and dodging drunk guests. She buried her talent deep inside, thinking it was useless. She hadn't touched a piano in 6 months because it hurt too much to remember what she had lost. Harrison Wells, the host of the party, was the only person in the room who knew any of this. He had met Jenny a few weeks ago when she was working a late-night corporate dinner at his office building. Everyone had left, and the cleaning crew was finishing up. Harrison had stayed late to finish some paperwork. As he walked through the empty lobby, he had heard music. It was faint, coming from the banquet hall. He had peeked inside and seen Jenny sitting at the dusty old upright piano. The hotel kept in the corner for decoration. She hadn't known anyone was watching. She was playing with a vulnerability that broke his heart. He had stood there for an hour, listening to her pour her soul into the keys. He recognized her pain. He saw a young woman with the weight of the world on her shoulders, finding a moment of peace in the music. When she finished, he had clapped. She had been terrified, thinking she was going to be fired for touching the equipment. Instead, he had asked her why she wasn't playing in a concert hall. She had told him her story, her voice cracking with embarrassment and shame. She felt like she had failed. Harrison, a self-made man who had started with nothing, had seen a reflection of himself in her. He knew that talent was a terrible thing to waste. He realized that while he had millions of dollars, he couldn't buy the kind of emotion she put into her music. He decided right then that he would use his resources to give her a platform. He didn't want her to just be a waitress ever again. He wanted the world to see her. That was why she was here tonight. But there was another reason, a secret one that Harrison had kept to himself. While the guests were listening to the music, believing it was just a performance, Harrison had made a few phone calls earlier that day. Sitting in the very back of the room, mingling with the staff and standing in the shadows, were 2 men in dark suits. They weren't waiters, and they weren't security guards. They were talent scouts from 2 of the biggest recording companies in the country. Harrison had used his influence to get them here. He knew they wouldn't come to see a waitress on a normal day, but they would come to his party. He had invited them under the pretense of discussing business deals. But the real deal was happening on the stage. These scouts were notorious for being cold and hard to impress. They spent their lives listening to the best musicians in the world, and they were usually bored by it. But tonight, standing in the back of the ballroom, they were as still as the statues in the garden. They weren't looking at their phones. They weren't whispering to each other about the stock market. They were watching Jenny's hands. They were analyzing her phrasing, her timing, and the emotional intensity of her playing. They knew, just as the man in the tuxedo knew, that this level of skill wasn't taught in a few years of lessons. It was a gift. And more than that, it was a sellable gift. In a music industry full of auto-tune and flashy lights, here was someone with raw, undeniable authenticity. As Jenny played the final, heart-wrenching chords of the slow movement, The scouts looked at each other. The look on their faces was one of greedy realization. They knew they were witnessing a star being born. They were already mentally calculating contracts, imagining the albums, the tours, and the money. But beyond the business, they were just human beings who loved music, and they were being moved by it. The secret plan was working. The disaster was turning into the discovery of a lifetime. The music began to build again, moving toward the end. The guests sensed the shift. The somber mood began to lift, replaced by a sense of anticipation. They had stopped judging her outfit or her job. They had stopped wondering why Harrison had put her on stage. They were just listening. The barriers between the rich guests and the waitress had dissolved. In that moment, there was no money, no status, no uniforms. There was only the sound of the piano connecting them all. The secret was out, at least in spirit. The waitress wasn't just a waitress. She was a musician, and she was about to change her life. The music was building toward its final moment. Jenny's hands were moving faster than ever, flying up and down the keyboard in a blur of motion. The sound was rising, growing louder and more intense with every second. It felt like a storm was breaking inside the ballroom. The guests were on the edge of their seats, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm of the music. They weren't thinking about their money or their status anymore. They were completely caught up in the storm. Jenny's face was glistening with sweat, her hair falling slightly out of place, but she didn't care. She was giving everything she had. She was playing with a fierce intensity, pouring all her hidden pain, all her hard work, all her dreams into the notes. Then, with a dramatic flourish, she struck the final chords. They rang out loud and clear, echoing through the vast room like thunder. Her hands came down hard on the keys, and then she pulled them back into her lap. She sat there for a moment, her chest heaving, staring at the keys as if they were an old friend she hadn't seen in years. The sound hung in the air for a second, vibrating off the walls, before slowly fading into complete silence. For a heartbeat, the room was still. The guests were frozen, staring at the stage. It was so quiet you could hear the wind outside the large windows. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They were all processing what they had just heard. It was as if they had woken up from a trance. The girl they had mocked, the girl they had ignored, had just taken them on an emotional journey that none of them would ever forget. The judgment, the arrogance, and the snobbery of the past hour had been completely wiped away by the sheer power of her talent. Then, a single sound broke the silence. It was Harrison clapping. He stood near the side of the stage, his hands moving together with a steady, loud rhythm. He wasn't just clapping politely. He was applauding with passion. He was looking at Jenny with a huge, proud smile on his face, like a father watching his daughter succeed. Slowly, the spell broke. Another person joined in the clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted. It wasn't just a polite applause that people give out of obligation. It was a roar. It was a wave of sound that washed over the stage. The guests rose to their feet as one. 300 people in expensive clothes, who had arrived expecting to be entertained by a famous star, were now giving a standing ovation to a waitress. Jenny sat on the bench, stunned. She looked out at the sea of people standing and cheering for her. Her face turned pale and then flushed a deep red. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The man who had checked his watch was now clapping so hard his hands were red. The woman who had giggled behind her fan was wiping a tear from her eye, clapping enthusiastically. The guests who had treated her like invisible furniture just an hour ago were now looking at her with pure admiration and respect. It was a moment of total transformation. She wasn't the help anymore. She was the queen of the ball. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling a little shaky. She gave a shy, awkward curtsy, the way she used to do when she was a little girl performing in a school recital. She didn't know how to act in this situation. She felt exposed, but in a good way. She felt seen. The applause grew even louder as she bowed her head humbly. It was a sound she would hear in her dreams for the rest of her life. As the clapping began to die down slightly, Harrison walked onto the stage. The crowd quieted down, curious to see what he would say. He reached out and gently placed a hand on Jenny's shoulder. She flinched slightly, surprised by the contact, but then looked up at him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison said, his voice booming through the microphone, "I told you we had a treat tonight. But talent like Jenny's doesn't just belong to us for one night. It belongs to the world." He gestured toward the back of the room, where the two men in dark suits had been standing. "I invited some friends tonight. They are people who know a lot about music, and I think they have something they want to say." The spotlight moved to the back of the room. The two talent scouts walked forward. The guests turned to watch, murmuring among themselves. They recognized these men. They were famous in the industry, the kind of people who could make or destroy a career with a single signature. The scouts walked up to the stage with serious expressions on their faces. They stopped in front of Jenny. One of the men, a tall man with silver hair, looked at her. He didn't smile. He just looked her in the eyes with a serious gaze. "Miss," he said, his voice gruff but sincere, "I have been in this business for 40 years. I have heard the best pianists in New York, in London, and in Tokyo. I have never heard anything like that in my life. Not with that kind of soul." He pulled a business card out of his jacket pocket and held it out to her. "I don't usually do this at parties, but I want to sign you. I want to record you. If you are willing, I want to make you a star." The room gasped. The guests couldn't believe it. A recording contract, right here on the stage. It felt like a movie scene, but it was real. The second scout stepped forward and handed her his card as well. "Don't listen to him," he joked lightly. "Sign with us. We will treat you like the artist you are." Jenny stood there, holding two small cards in her trembling hands. She looked down at them. It was her name, but it didn't feel like her name. It felt like a ticket to a different life. She looked up at Harrison, tears now streaming down her face. She didn't know what to say. She had come here tonight worrying about rent and tips, and now she was being handed a career. Harrison leaned closer to the microphone. "And to make sure you have the time to focus on your music, and to make sure you never have to worry about taking a shift when you should be practicing." He paused for dramatic effect. "I am setting up a scholarship fund. It will cover the rest of your education at the conservatory. Pay off your parents' debts and ensure you have everything you need to succeed. This isn't a loan, Jenny. It's an investment. I believe in you." Crowd went wild again. They cheered louder than before. They were clapping for Jenny, but they were also cheering for Harrison, for the magic of the moment, and for the fact that sometimes dreams really do come true. It was a feel-good moment that nobody in that room would ever forget. Jenny turned to Harrison. She didn't care about the money or the fame in that specific second. She just felt grateful. She stepped forward and hugged him. It was an unprofessional hug, a tight, desperate squeeze from a young woman who had been holding too much in for too long. Harrison laughed, a deep, happy sound, and hugged her back. She turned back to the audience and wiped her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She took a deep breath and smiled. It wasn't the shy smile of a waitress anymore. It was the smile of an artist. "Thank you," she whispered into the microphone. "Thank you for listening." The party didn't end there, but for Jenny, the main event was over. She walked off the stage, but she didn't go back to the kitchen. She was swept up by guests who wanted to meet her, to shake her hand, to tell her how much her music had moved them. They treated her like a celebrity. They offered her drinks, which she took, and they asked for her autograph, which she gave with a laugh. The disaster that everyone had expected had turned into the greatest success story of the year. It was a night that proved a powerful lesson to everyone in the room. They learned that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. They learned that true talent doesn't care about how much money you have or what kind of clothes you wear. It shines through regardless. And most importantly, they learned that sometimes the person serving your coffee might just be a genius in disguise, waiting for the world to stop and listen. As the night went on, the music of the band started up again, but nobody was listening to them. They were all still hearing the notes of the girl who played the piano with her heart.